21st century has been an interesting one. Some of us have been able to bear witness to a continual progression of certain trends. Many of you know in the early, mid, and even late 2000s that essentially for a decade, the big thing, the in thing, was anti-theism. A lot of this was related to 9/11, and no, this is not intentional. I'm not making this video on 9/11 because it's 9/11. It just happened to be that way. But there was an influx and interest in anti-theism and religion and discussing religion, and there were forums, and that's how Sam Harris became the well-known author and pundit that he is, and arguably how Christopher Hitchens got really big, the late Christopher Hitchens, and of course Richard Dawkins, who had been known in scientific circles, but really had been largely unknown to the greater public in that sense. Really, really powerful stuff at the time, and YouTube, when it came around, was a format for that. People, the amazing atheist, his name tells it all. Thunderfoot started off as an anti-theist, a guy making basically anti-theist response videos and so on and so forth. But, as all great causes, if you wish to call them that came to an end. And in doing so, there needed to be a transition. Some people survived the transition, other people not so much. Thunderfoot, for example, survived the transition quite well. And what transition am I talking about? I'm talking about going from anti-theist to anti-feminist. Now, how are the two related? Well, nominally they're not, although some people could argue or have argued that feminism is just another kind of religion, and it certainly shares some qualities and characteristics of a traditional religion. But ultimately, this is just about trends, right? And anti-feminism is the current trend of our age. That is, things that are popular, and MGTOW is not popular, let's be honest, not in that sense. Things that are popular that people make videos about are, anti-feminist videos, feminist response videos. Even now, Thunderfoot is putting out videos about, you guessed it, Anita Sarkeesian. Anita Sarkeesian, to my mind, is one of the least interesting people in the world, but she's a well-known feminist, and there's this constant back and forth between anti-feminists and feminists, and I think a lot of it is artificial and manufactured, if only because it's a genre. It's a genre, and frankly speaking, it's a lucrative genre, and it's one where you can make money off of, and it's popular. Just like anti-theism was that way for a while. And, look at The Amazing Atheist, for example. I don't really follow his stuff, but basically every time I look at his channel, he's completely transitioned to the whole feminists are batshit crazy, having moved away from anti-theism. If for whatever reason, if anti-theism, for example, were to be a big thing again, or let's say there was some other version of 9/11 or what have you, yeah, you could see a bit of a comeback. But things of this nature obviously don't last forever. And, we've speculated on this before. I had a brief discussion with Teal there about this. We had the anti-theism. Now we have anti-feminism. What comes next? So essentially what I want to talk about in this video is what the next big anti is. And I think the next big anti is probably going to be anti-progressivism. Now, in a lot of ways, progressivism seems to sort of almost dovetail almost identically with feminism, that is the values and whatever. But there are larger implications, and feminism tends to be just very focused on, in a sense, on specific values with regards to women. Mostly talk about women. Progressivism encompasses sort of the entirety of society, and how do we know this? We already see a splintering of people who would traditionally place themselves on the left end of the political spectrum, but do not identify with people who call themselves progressives. I guess you could call them moderate liberals, although, of course, people on the right think that all people on the left are identical. It's obviously not true. And you see this splintering. Sargon of Akkad has kind of talked about this, and I think he's off the top of my head, the best exemplar of this. That is to say, people traditionally on the left who don't really identify with being on the left anymore. And they're even to some degree willing to partner up with people on the right, which I guess in former times was reasonably unthinkable. And this is because progressivism has become kind of the next batshit crazy. The demonization of people, all the things progressives rail against, racism, and yet they practice racism themselves. The bizarre ideas about human beings, the denial. I mean, feminists do this as well, who tend to be progressives, but the denial of a human nature, of a distinct human nature, of differences between human beings, and the policies that they push. Now, I'm hardly an economic expert, but you don't need to be one to realize that progressive economic policies tend to be pretty destructive and in the long term and don't really contribute a lot to economic growth. So you're kind of getting this smorgasbord or rather smorgasbord is a Swedish word, of really bad ideas all put into this basket we call progressivism. And rational, liberal, that is left-leaning people are seeing that aspect of leftivism, if you will, as a disaster and something to be countered. And I think because progressivism represents a much bigger set of trends rather than just feminism, that once anti-feminism has run its course, once it's no longer trendy to address any Sarkeesian and the Gamergate has died down, and to my knowledge I think it has for the most part, when all this stuff is kind of dissipated, the next big thing will probably almost certainly, and I'm not guaranteeing this, but I think it's very, very likely, anti-progressivism. And you'll hear, I think you'll see rather, alliances between people who are moderate liberals on the left and people on the right. The people who are on extreme right know because, they think all left people on the left are identical and there are no differences whatsoever. And, leftists are leftists and blah, blah, blah. These are not particularly rational people, no more so than progressives are. But people of different political bents, of rational mind, will band together, and they already have. You've seen collaborations between Sargon and some other people, Milo Yiannopoulos and another radio host in the United States. You see this, and I think it's kind of the beginning of a trend, because I don't think anti-feminism will die completely, but it's gonna lose its gusto. It's gonna lose its steam, and it's gonna have to be replaced by something. Especially if, well, let's face it, the genre is some sort of genre of anti-whatever is going to continue. Anti-theism was the genre of a decade. Anti-feminism, I think you could say anti-feminism is the genre of our decade, and I think it might continue until the end of the decade. But because the policies of batshit progressives are so extreme, and the way they've sort of infected everything, I mean, progressivism is responsible for the strange way a lot of games are developed, say by BioWare. Let me go on record here. I have no problem with trans or gay or any of this stuff. It's just the way it's kind of forced into the game in a highly artificial manner that you see, say, companies such as BioWare do. There are other examples, but progressivism is everywhere. It's in government policy, it's in education, it's in the video game industry. And this probably will be the next logical target because it's not really beneficial to society. Economically, it's a disaster. Socially, it's a disaster. It tends to be racist. And progressives' partners in crime, and maybe some of them actually are progressives, are often feminists, and we all know just how rational and reasonable feminism is. So this is going to be in the coming decade, I think, and towards the end of this decade as well, if I'm still alive and around, something that is going to be big. And I suspect that a lot of the YouTube big guys, the giants who transition from anti-theism to anti-feminism are going to transition to essentially anti-progressivism. And really there will be a concerted effort in separating out left liberal-leaning politics from progressivism. Where there's overlap, I think the distinctions will be even more strongly enforced, so people will become aware of the differences. Because everyone with half a brain knows that, for example, progressive economic policies, long term, don't really work too well. Their social policies are sowing the seeds of division. I mean, nobody does a better job at splitting people up into different groups and making everyone. This is the thing. At the same time, they claim there are no differences between people, but progressives split people up into different groups, claiming everyone is the same, but also claiming that they're different, and they're just a mess. And they have penetrated every level of our society. I'm not politically aligned. I'm not right. I'm not really left. I'm nothing. I'm certainly not a progressive, and I oppose progressivism, just like I oppose extreme, frankly speaking, right-wing politics. But this is going to be the next target, I think, both commercially as well as philosophically, for the big antis that we are seeing. As for myself, I'm, I guess, technically an anti-something, but I don't really get too much into the whole anti-response trend, because I find it intellectually limiting for myself. And I suppose it limits me financially, but I'd rather have that and be more flexible in the kinds of material and topics I cover. So this is a prediction as well as an observation of things that shall come to pass, I think, very likely at the very least. As always, thanks for watching, and more to come, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.